Chapter 22. Last Dance. Dalton looked out of his window at Emmett's farmhouse, now a raging inferno. Pieces of burning debris scattered the yard around it from the explosion moments before. He didn't speculate, didn't need to, that this may be some sort of accident. This was the work of Brad Wesley. Just like the explosion at Red's had been, just like everything bad in this town always was. Taking and taking. Dalton didn't wait around. He threw the barn window open and jumped out onto the roof, before leaping down to bounce off a hay bale and quickly head towards the blaze. As he ran, Dalton remembered the sinking feeling in his gut as he'd watched Red's shop burning and had wondered if Red had been inside. The same feeling returned. At this time of night, Emmett would have been home. He ran all the faster. When he got to the front door, he shouted out to the old rancher, "Emmett!" but was met with no answer, only the roar of flames. The windows of the house were all broken out, the curtains on the inside rimming the frames with fire, but somehow the old wooden front door was still standing. Dalton kicked it off its hinges, ignoring the burst of heat that assaulted him as he ran inside. He found Emmett on the floor of the kitchen, lying by an old iron stove. The kitchen seemed to be the only room not fully ablaze, the sturdy brick walls and the heavy appliances somehow shielding the place from the effects of the initial blast. Smoke was already filling the room, and Dalton couldn't tell if the farmer was breathing, didn't have time to check. He reached down, grabbed an arm, and scooped him up with a single heave, throwing him over his shoulders. He managed to carry him like that back to the front door and nearly stumbled as he carted him down the porch stairs. The doc was waiting there, concern on her face for him and for Emmett both. But here, with the heat of the fire still stinging his naked back, was not where Dalton was going to let her tend to the old man. He continued on, away from the house, the doc following. It was a good job he did. He felt and heard a blast behind him as something else inside the building ignited and blew, the shockwave knocking them all to the ground in a heap. When he recovered, Dalton saw that the doc was beside him, on her knees. She seemed fine, so he turned his attention to the old man laid out on the ground. "Emmett, talk to me," he said, rolling the old rancher onto his back and feeling some relief at his sudden coughing. "It's Dalton. Are you all right?" Emmett took a minute to gather himself, looking up at Dalton, who was holding him down on the grass. In his red one-piece pajamas, coughing through his singed white beard, he looked every bit like Santa Claus after a sleigh crash. "I'd be fine if you'd get off me," he told Dalton. Dalton laughed with relief. He was alive and still had his sense of humour. The revving noise of a motorcycle engine drew Dalton's attention. He looked over to see a dirt bike pulling away from behind the remains of the farmhouse. Its rider wore a sleeveless denim shirt and wasn't even trying to hide his face. In fact, he paused for a moment to look back at his work and laugh loudly. Jimmy. Something in Dalton finally snapped. He watched the bike move onto the dirt road that ran along the river and back to the highway. Then he started running along through the woods to cut it off, a wolf stalking its prey. When he had the timing right, he broke into a sprint and leapt over an elevated mound, intercepting the rider and knocking him to the ground. Both men tumbled in the dirt. Dalton was the first to his feet, but he was too far away from Jimmy to capitalize on that. When the other man did scramble up, he took on his fighting stance, a near mirror of Dalton's own. He looked Dalton in the eye and declared, "Prepare to die," as if he was a villain in some cheap movie. If Dalton saw himself in the same way, he would probably have replied with something more clever or noble, but instead he just spoke his mind. "You are such an asshole," he replied through gritted teeth. Jimmy threw the first blow, a kick to the leg that was designed to test Dalton's reactions and open a gap. He followed it with a left to the face. Dalton intercepted both and returned with a punch and a kick of his own. The two traded blows back and forth, neither man landing a clean enough shot to get the advantage. To anyone watching, it would quickly have been clear that, despite their similar stances, the two men employed very different styles. Jimmy came forward with every strike he threw, his punches coming from the hip and with all his energy behind them, his feet landing on the strike with a yell like a karateka. Every blow was designed to kill. Dalton moved more gracefully, flowing away from his opponent's hits and then back in again for counter-strikes just as smoothly, his kicks coming in looping arcs. The flow of the fight changed as Jimmy caught Dalton in a grapple and threw him over his shoulder to the ground. Dalton rolled with the impact, held on to Jimmy's arm and drove his feet up into the other man's gut, using all his leg strength to launch Jimmy up and through the air. He landed with a thud on the hard-packed sand by the river's edge. As Jimmy struggled to his feet, Dalton flew at him through the air, landing a knee to the chest that put him back down. Dalton aimed to finish it then, posting up on one knee by his downed opponent's head and reining in the blows. But he underestimated the other man's skill on the ground. Jimmy caught his arm and spun his whole body around to lock in an armbar. Dalton's muscles strained as he fought to stop his arm from straightening out. He knew he had two options. He could let the armbar sink in, hear his elbow shatter, and be dead a minute later. Or he could roll out of the move. Option 2 would mean he'd be the one down on the floor, with Jimmy on his feet and with the advantage. But it wasn't really a choice. Dalton rolled out and tried to get back up, but Jimmy was quickly on him, bearing down from above. Dalton landed a shot to the gut, but it wasn't enough to slow the other man down. Jimmy fired in from above with a big elbow, all his weight behind it, and caught Dalton clean on the back of his neck. Dalton felt a sharp pain down his spine, and his eyes flashed white. Jimmy followed up with a knee, and Dalton fell backward, trying to recover and wondering if his neck was broken. He crawled onto his hands and knees, squeezing the sand below him through his fists, feeling the grit through his fingers and knowing he wouldn't be able to do that if his spine had snapped. Jimmy advanced on him, sensing victory, and Dalton kicked out, the blow landing clean in his opponent's body and driving him back. In a moment, they were both back on their feet, both starting to breathe hard, and both knowing that this fight wasn't going to be quick, and it wasn't going to be easy. The dance continued, blows being parried and traded, with no way to tell who, if anyone, was gaining the advantage. If this fight had been in a ring, it would have been even on the judges' scorecards. If it had been in the ring, it would have had rules too. But it wasn't, and there were none. Dalton threw Jimmy down into the sand, grabbed the other man's hair to deliver a knee to the face, and then collapsed in pain as Jimmy smashed a length of driftwood he'd picked up across his ribs. Dalton heard the breaking of the timber, but he felt the breaking of at least 2 of his ribs. As he curled face down on the sand, every breath he took sent a sharp shooting pain through his body. He couldn't breathe, and without oxygen to power them, his muscles were useless. He was useless. Jimmy reined in a few more punches to the body just to make sure it was done. Then he stood over Dalton, reached down, running a hand under one of his downed opponent's arms and over his shoulder into a half Nelson. With the other hand, he grabbed Dalton's hair and dragged him up to his feet. "I used to fuck guys like you in prison," he growled viciously. Dalton tried to break free, but his body wasn't doing what he told it to. Jimmy tossed him to the floor and landed another kick to the ribs for good measure. Dalton could taste the blood in his mouth. He felt his hair being grabbed again, tensed his neck as Jimmy pulled him back up to his feet, taking his time. Summoning all his remaining strength, Dalton threw a big left hook at his opponent's head. Jimmy ducked it easily, lazily almost, then smashed into Dalton with a hook to the body and a knee to the head. Dalton stumbled backward, colliding with a skinny old half-dead tree that was the only thing that prevented him from sprawling in the dirt. If that had happened, he knew he wouldn't be getting back up again. He grabbed at a curved piece of the tree trunk to hold himself from falling, then spun around to face his killer, deciding to go out looking him in the eye. Dalton saw that Jimmy was enjoying this, Wesley's dog playing with his food. He stalked from side to side, just out of reach and just barely containing the animal will to pounce and end the fight, savouring the power. "Damn, boy!" Jimmy laughed at him viciously. "I thought you were good." The tree behind him was the only thing keeping Dalton on his feet, a Y-shaped parting in the trunk propping him up. But as he felt the rough bark on his back, he also felt his lungs start to open up. He breathed in, feeling some energy returning to his arms and legs. "Go fuck yourself," he managed. Jimmy grinned at that, blood running from his nose and down from a cut over one of his psychotic-looking eyes. The grin suddenly turned to a look of targeted anger as he launched himself forward with a yell, aiming to deliver a brutal sidekick that was designed to crush Dalton's chest. Dalton moved just in time. Jimmy had correctly aimed his kick through, not at, his target, but this meant that his boot flew in through the gap in the tree's trunk and out the other side. Dalton quickly caught his ankle, yanking it back with all the strength he could muster, and being rewarded with a loud crack and a louder scream from Jimmy. Dalton followed this up with a quick kick to his opponent's exposed groin. Jimmy's body reacted by allowing him to pull his foot free from the tree, but all he could do was stand there, holding his groin and trying not to topple over. Dalton lifted him up to standing with a knee to the head, then threw one punch into Jimmy's body, another to his face, then another and another. With each shot, Dalton felt like he was getting stronger, not weaker, righteous anger giving him drive and strength. With one last series of kicks, he knocked Wesley's battered enforcer to the ground. Jimmy collapsed onto his hands and knees, broken face dripping red pools on the sand and breathing hard, seemingly unable to move. Dalton turned quickly as he heard running footsteps approaching, half expecting another attacker to emerge from the woods. Instead, it was the doc. When he looked back to Jimmy again, the other man had somehow managed to raise himself up on one knee during the moment's distraction. Dalton watched as he pulled a revolver out of a concealed ankle holster and stumbled up all the way to his feet. Jimmy pointed the gun at Dalton and growled, "I'm gonna kill you the old-fashioned way." Somewhere in the back of his mind, Dalton heard Garrett's raspy voice reminding him, "When a man sticks a gun in your face, you've got two choices. You can die, or you can kill the motherfucker." Dalton threw up a kick as Jimmy pulled the trigger, his foot landing on the gunman's wrist and knocking it just as the revolver went off. Dalton thought he felt the bullet zip by his ear as he rushed in. For all he knew, he'd been hit and was already dead, just too amped up to know it yet. One thing he knew was that he wasn't waiting around for a second shot. Another thing he knew was that if he was dead and on his way to hell, this bastard was coming with him. Dalton looped his arm around Jimmy's, securing the gun behind his back and out of the way, then leaned back, locking his opponent's shoulder out with an audible crunch. Jimmy's chest flew outward in reaction, his face looking up into the night sky in a rictus of pain, his neck exposed. Dalton formed the fingers of his free right hand into an iron claw and then drove it with all his might into Jimmy's throat. He felt the skin rip under his fingers, felt the digits drive in through thick muscle and sinew, felt them wrap tightly around the thick cord of the trachea. Then, in a gore-filled motion, He ripped his fist out, flesh and blood flying through the air, and kicked Jimmy's body into the nearby river's edge. All the energy was gone from Dalton. He collapsed to his knees as the doc ran on past him, grabbing Jimmy's corpse as it started to float into the water. Using all her strength, she dragged the body back to the shore and flipped him onto his back, no doubt ready to start CPR. She gasped as she saw the man's dead eyes looking up, a hole in his throat that looked like he'd been hit with a shotgun. There was no saving him. Dalton looked at her and then looked down at his bloody hands. She stared back at him, stunned. Something changed in those blue eyes of hers, and she started to walk off. He let her go. It wasn't the body that caused the sickened look on the doc's face, Dalton knew. She'd seen plenty of dead men in her line of work. It was realizing what Dalton was capable of, who he really was. Dalton was barely able to stand, but as he looked across the river to the big ranch house on the other side, he knew that somewhere over there, Brad Wesley was watching. "Wesley!" he called out, hoarsely at first. He stumbled to the corpse at the edge of the river and grabbed it by the back of the shirt. "Wesley!" He walked out into the cold river until it was up to his waist, floating the body out with him. Looking over at the ranch house, he saw Wesley appear on his balcony. He wanted him to see this. "Fuck you!" he screamed as he thrust the body of Wesley's dead dog back towards him and watched the current take it.